bunch. My name is Sam. If you are a returning viewer, thank you so much. And if you are a newbie, welcome to this community. I am going to be doing a little bit of a book review today, but it is going to be a little bit different to normal because instead of doing a specific book or a series, I'm actually going to be talking about my little collection of H.G Wells books. So I have quite a few of his. He is probably one of my favorite sci-fi authors, but I do find that some of his books are a little bit hit and miss. So I'm going to talk about all the ones in my collection that I have. I have read them all. I'll tell you about the ones I didn't like and the ones that I really did like. And yeah, we'll get right into the video. So the first one that I have is The History of Mr. Polly. I got this little vintage edition of The History of Mr. Polly at the Lifeline Book Fest last time that I was there. It was in the collected editions. I don't normally get hard copies because I don't normally tend to like reading hard copies, but because it was a vintage and it was a H.G Wells, I thought that I would pick it up. I didn't love this one. This is very similar to George Orwell's Coming Up for Air. It's basically just a book that talks about a guy and you're just kind of going through a section of his life and what happens to him. It's not really anything exciting and I didn't really learn anything from the book. So it wasn't really amazing. It just talks about this guy who basically he is your everyday guy who has an everyday life, and he's basically sick of living in the mundane, so he basically leaves his wife and goes to find some kind of adventure or just a change. So it's basically a story of essentially a midlife crisis and how that kind of develops and his feelings and different things like that. Like I said, didn't love it. I'd probably only give it a 2. So not starting off strong for H.G Wells, but it's alright. I promise it gets better. But yeah, not one of my favourites, but if you're into that kind of thing, you might like it more than I. Then we have The War of the Worlds by H.G Wells. My copy of this is quite battered because I have moved a few times and different things, and it's a relatively old copy now. Plus, I believe I got this one secondhand already, so it was already a little bit worn and old. I love this book. I think this is probably my favourite of his ever. I know that's probably a cliche because it's his most famous work, but I truly believe it's famous for a reason because it is his best that I've read. I think it's far better than the movie, and it's such a good short sci-fi read. I loved every moment of it. So basically it follows this guy and he is trying to survive the attack on the world by these aliens that have come down from space, and they're basically trying to either destroy them or just outlast them. And it's kind of his journey of how he stays alive and his very close encounters with some of the aliens and different things like that, and kind of what happens to the world and all of that kind of thing, and how they were very unprepared for what happened. It was so good. I really recommend this. I gave this a 5 out of 5. It's definitely my favorite. I also have The Invisible Man. This one was pretty decent. Definitely not my favorite, but still a really good read. It was very interesting to read about. Like, even for a sci-fi, I feel like the idea was very out there. So it follows this man who he basically invents this process and this substance to render his body invisible to the human eye. You can touch him, but only if obviously you can find him. And he can't make himself visible again. And so it's like a journey of his survival, because if you're invisible, like, how do you get food? How do you get money? How do you live? So yeah, it was really interesting. It kind of also plays with the idea that, like, when it is about survival, what happens to your morals and different things like that. I did really like it. I'd probably give it a 3.5 out of 5 stars. So then we have The Shape of Things to Come. This book I really didn't like. Some people really love this book of his. I really didn't. I actually ended up DNFing it because it was so difficult for me to read. So this book is about how. So it's basically after H.G Wells lived through the First World War and seen everything. This was kind of what he thought would happen in the future once he was kind of dead and gone, and how the world would kind of turn out. It is so heavily political and very, like, there's very strong opinions, but also it's almost like you're reading a textbook more than you're reading a novel. And I think that's why I really didn't like it, because I'm fine with people talking about politics and things like that in books. Like, you guys know that I like George Orwell's 1984 and things like that. Like, they're all political, but he writes it in such a way that it's like I'm reading a textbook, and unless you have a really strong, logical, political mind and interests, you probably won't like this. It also talks about a lot of things that are not like familiar to us anymore, because it was written like back at the very beginning of the 1900s, like who was in power and who was kind of a rising figure and who was such and such as deputy or secretary or all of that kind of thing. We don't really know about that anymore. Like, we're not very familiar with it. It's not just general knowledge. Unless you've really studied the war and things like that, you're not going to know those kind of things. And also, like, the political turmoil that they were having at the time, we're not super familiar with that. And so it's really hard to read about and be focused on it and really enjoy it, because you're kind of going, okay, what is he talking about? I don't understand. That's how I felt anyway, because like I said, I'm not super familiar with political history. I'm not super interested in that kind of thing. So it was really difficult for me to continue. And also the way he writes about it is very textbooky. So unless you're into that kind of thing, I wouldn't recommend this. Like I said, I DNF'd it, so I'm not even going to give it a rating. But yeah, definitely not my favorite. I also read The First Men in the Moon. This book was really good. I did really like this one. This is about two men, and one of them is a scientist and one of them is a businessman who has actually gone bankrupt, and so he's trying to like claw his way back into society and money and things like that. And they kind of meet and they become friends, and the scientist discovers this, I guess you'd call it a substance or an element or whatever, that can cause propulsion and like continual propulsion, I guess you would say, because he was trying to create levitation, and like to counteract gravity. So it's meant to be a substance that counteracts gravity. And they basically decide that they're going to go to the moon together, and then discover all about the moon, come back and tell the world, and get rich off this substance and all of that kind of thing. And so they create this metal ball, and they use that as a spaceship, because it's like hollow on the inside, and they like kit it out with stuff. And they put these windows on this ball, and then put these metal flap things over it that they can control, so they can use it kind of a bit like a rudder, in the sense that like they can control their direction that they're going with it. And if they're not careful, they'll just keep going into space forever if they like overshoot the moon or a planet or whatever, because of this substance that they're using. And it's really good. It's so interesting as well, because like this was well before the moon landing. This was well before anyone knew anything really about the moon at all. And so to hear somebody invent what they think it's going to be like was so interesting and so cool. And he was wrong on a lot of counts, but that's all right. It was still really, really good. And I guess it is fiction as well. So, like, there was some fantastical elements to it. So, yeah, basically, it follows these two guys. They land on the moon after, like, creating this substance. And it's about their encounters on the moon. And they encounter these insect like alien things that have this society, and they almost describe them kind of like ants, like they almost have that kind of structure to their society. And yeah, it's all about this moon adventure and what happens and how they get home and all the different things. And it's written sort of like a journal, or almost like the guy was kind of retelling what happened to him. So that's kind of the format. I really, really liked it. I'd probably give this a 4 out of 5 stars, maybe even a 4.5 out of 5 stars. Because, yeah, it was really good. I definitely think it's one of his better books for sure. Definitely goes to show why he's a master in science fiction, 100%, because this just oozes science fiction. But yeah, it's so good. I also, of course, read The Time Machine. This is another really good one of his. I would probably give this a 4 out of 5 stars. This is a book about a man who invents a time machine, and instead of going backwards in time like most people do, he goes really, 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 really far in the future. So he basically goes so far into the future that Earth isn't as we know it. Humans don't exist anymore. There are creatures there, but they don't seem to be very human at all. Um, I mean, I guess they sort of are, but like not like us. Like they're very primal type situation, and it's split into two different groups. And he basically shows up in this timeline or this time, and he like has a little look around, and then he goes to go back home, and he finds out that his time machine's been stolen. So it then turns into this adventure of him trying to get back his time machine so that he can return back to his time. And yeah, he basically has to survive this, essentially what would be like another planet. I mean, it is still Earth, but like it's so different that it's almost like he was on another planet. And yeah, it was so good, so interesting. I can't say that I've ever read anything quite like it. I've never seen the movie, so I don't know if it compares. But yeah, let me know in the comments below if you know if the movie is any good, because I might give that a watch. But yeah, definitely really liked it. I would definitely recommend it. Like I said, 4 out of 5. And the last book I have of H.G Wells is The Island of Dr. Moreau. This book, again, another one of his really good books. It again shows that he is a science fiction master. So this is about a man who, he basically gets shipwrecked or marooned, I guess, on an island, and he gets found by this guy named Dr. Moreau. And Dr. Moreau lives on this island, and it's basically his island where he and this like assistant of his live. And they basically create creatures and like play with human DNA and animal DNA and different things like that. And so this guy gets marooned on this island. He meets Dr. Moreau and the assistant and some of these creatures, and like it very quickly descends into chaos. And it's about this guy that's been marooned trying to get off this island, get back home, survive the ordeal, and hopefully, like, I guess, expose Dr. Moreau for what's happening, because Dr. Moreau is on this island because he's trying to hide from authority and different things like that, so he can do whatever experiments he feels like without being governed. And yeah, it very quickly goes awry. Um, Even though everything was fine before this guy showed up, I guess when this guy showed up, he kind of tipped the balance and different things. And it's really interesting to read about. It's really interesting to hear kind of H.G Wells' thoughts about what happens if you abuse science and biology, and if you take it into your own hands kind of situation. It does highlight the dangers of experimentation and taking things too far, and when you are playing God, like how dangerous that can be. Yeah, but it was super interesting to read about. I think it's definitely worth a read, and I'd probably give this 3.5, 4 out of 5 stars. I didn't like it as much as some of his others, but I still, yeah, really enjoyed the book. So they are all of the H.G Wells books I own, and obviously all the ones that I've read. I do plan on possibly getting a few of his other books as well, but I'm not 100% sure when I'll be getting those ones. But like I said, I've already got a substantial collection, and I will hopefully be able to pick the other ones up as secondhand copies, because he has written so many books, it's not funny. And I'll probably go broke before I can afford to buy them all, but that's all right. I hope that you guys have an amazing week, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!